Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Erin Chandler. Erin is the author of 3 books, Cinderella Sweeping Up, Junebug vs. Hurricane, and her newest book, Bluegrass Sons, a true crime memoir. Erin, it's really a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, David.
I read the book, and it's really a great read, so I'm really excited to talk to you about it. I think it'd be fun if we started out with you reading a passage from the book.
Okay, absolutely. I will read a passage a little past the middle, but when we're getting sort of deep in, I'll read chapter 11. It's called Blood Aces, and it's when we're sort of deep into Las Vegas, and I'm explaining the characters that my dad moved from Kentucky to start working with and dealing with when it all gets all mixed in with the lawyers of Uncle Brad and how they met. My Uncle Brad was through my dad. Okay. Benny Binion was another nefarious character who made his way out to the desert town. My father was enchanted with the image of Benny arriving in Las Vegas just after World War II with $2 million cash in suitcases and his extended family packed in a Cadillac. What he didn't perhaps know, or at least care to acknowledge, was that Binion was one of the most dangerous criminals Texas had ever seen. According to the book Blood Aces, The Wild Ride of Benny Binion, the Texas Gangster Who Created Vegas Poker by Doug Swanson, Binion was a ruthless gangster with henchmen at the ready. "I do my own killing," the old cowboy famously repeated, even in his later years. Chan and I spent countless days lunching with the robust old outlaw in a bolo tie and cowboy hat at his casino coffee shop. The owner of Binion's Horseshoe was clearly fond of our father because we had a carte blanche at his casino. Maybe it was Daddy's cleverness and gusto or just his pedigree that made Dan Chandler seem like a good candidate for mayor of Las Vegas. Binion offered to bankroll the effort. My father respectfully passed. I think a failed 1960s run for Congress in Kentucky was all the politics he had in him. The mutual admiration continued, and when in need of a safe haven one hot summer night, it was to Benny's bosom that we were delivered. Chan and I were shaken from a dead sleep when we were living in the carriage house across the street from the Aladdin Hotel. The apartment was high up in the last room of an empty floor at the far end of the strip. Dan Chandler hustled his 8 and 10-year-olds out of their beds and into a waiting cab. God only knows what this came to prompt Daddy to rush us out in our pajamas at 3 a.m., but we were hurried downtown for safety. Binion's Horseshoe was on the dirtier, seedier side of Vegas, far from the main drag. Chan and I sat on the gold paisley carpeted stairs, peering through the banister out over the stale casino. Our father was below in a sea of blackjack tables, talking to good old Benny. Daddy looked up and smiled, raising his fist in the air, indicating mission accomplished. Through the old wooden railing, we raised our tiny fists back in unison. My memory of smiling demurely, looking on as the old cowboy patted my father on the back, makes me sad for the little girl in the clinging, clanging neon casino in the middle of the night. More sympathy comes from my 10-year-old brother, trying to grow up with an out-of-control father. A few years later, when he began to act out as a young teen, Chan was sent to Binion's Dude Ranch in Wyoming to straighten out. Daddy considering Benny Binion our savior is a level of bad judgment hard to reconcile. Maybe Chan got some much-needed fresh air and a few horse riding skills, but I doubt the cowboys running the ranch had a moral compass to which any young man should aspire. Former Las Vegas mayor and mob lawyer Oscar Goodman naturally feels differently about Benny Binion. I first met Oscar on the set of The Bionic Woman with Lindsay Wagner. I was 11 years old in 1976, and it was my first encounter with movie-making magic. Daddy convinced him to let me ride in the back seat of a car loaded with cameras on its hood. Oscar was filming a cameo and sat in the front seat with Lindsay. We drove down the strip as they played out the scene and exchanged dialogue. I remained off camera, hunkered down in the back seat, absolutely thrilled to pieces. It was another small step toward my inevitable foray into show business. Oscar spoke to me on the record in 2022. I knew he would not take kindly to me speaking harshly of our old friend Benny Binion at this stage of the game. He was a pretty tough dude, was as far as I ventured. Well, he was a rough dude, Oscar allowed politely in his long surviving Philadelphia accent, but I think, very gentlemanly towards ladies. This lawyerly statement was offered up to settle my feminine ideals as well as my delicate eyes and ears. He was certainly sweet to us. I softly matched his polite demeanor as we discussed this cold blooded killer. After all, it was no lie. Mr. Binion was nice to me. He might even have murdered for us if we had asked. As a little girl and later a teenager, it was impressed upon me that if anyone was cruel or mistreated me, it was in my power to make a phone call and someone would set them straight. I knew that meant threatened, beaten up, or even killed. Instead of horrifying me as it does now, I felt powerful, untouchable. It was comforting to feel taken care of. I can't see him being any other way than that, said Oscar, trained to defend and block out the most heinous of crimes. I wasn't going to quibble with Mr. Goodman, who had represented Uncle Brad, my father, my brother, as well as Lee and Jimmy Chagra. Oscar was a fixture in Daddy's Vegas world as much as Benny Binion, woven into the fabric of Nevada. That tight inner circle protected their own. If it wasn't your thing to shoot people on the street for stealing a few $100s, but your buddy's son did just that, it was perfectly acceptable to look the other way and enjoy a club sandwich at his casino coffee shop. Suspend your belief. Pretend everyone's good with the Lord. There was a time I had lunch with him every single day at a table that he had reserved for him at the Horseshoe, Goodman said jocularly, recalling Benny's wiles. I always get a kick out of it because Harry Claiborne, I don't know if you met Judge Claiborne, but he was a friend of your dad. I'm sure everyone was a friend of your dad's, and your dad was a friend of everybody. It would be a natural. Eddie LaRue, who was a private investigator, he used to eat with us. Teddy Binion, Binion's son, would come by. I liked Teddy very, very much. We would always eat the same thing. I was always on a diet in those days, so I would always have lettuce and tomato with a little vinegar and olive oil. Claiborne would have ham and hocks and lima beans, and Benny Binion used to eat squirrel stew, head and all. I bet that's the table that we had lunch 1,000 times, I laughed along, suspending my own sense of morality. Okay, then, Oscar laughed heartily. You remember that little squirrel, head always popped up with its glassy eyes and buck teeth? For a guy like me to imagine anybody eating squirrel. There was one law abiding character in our Vegas world, Richard P. Crane, originally from Connecticut. My father's best friend and lawyer relocated to California early in his career. Dick Crane was the president of the Bel Air Country Club in Los Angeles. He was also the former head of the organized crime and racketeering strike force for the U.S. Department of Justice in 13 western states. Dick Crane wasn't a creature of Las Vegas. He was a touchstone for my rambunctious father. He's the one person I can talk to who recognizes, among other things, our dangerously close friendship with Benny Binion. Yeah, he was tough, Dick remembered quietly of the Texas gangster. He was tough. We investigated him up one side and down the other. Dick was only 29 years old when he was named attorney at large, the youngest in the nation with the title. He ran the entire strike force with a team of guys throughout the West investigating and prosecuting the mafia. I personally took the task to get them out of Nevada, which during that time in the 60s and 70s, Nevada was all mobbed up. That was my job to bring these guys down, and we did. We got rid of every damn one of them, but it took a while. I wondered what Dick thought about the new breed of arguably rougher outlaws that cropped up in Vegas when the mob was run out. We discussed the book Blood Aces and how the author claims back in Texas, Benny Binion had adversaries murdered and occasionally buried alive. Yeah, he was vicious, Dick said casually. And Daddy sent Chan to Binion's ranch in Wyoming when he was a teenager? I nearly pleaded, like it was some respected children's camp. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dick had no answer. That wasn't very smart. I stated the obvious. Well, your dad, in retrospect, some things that, in retrospect, he laughed were regrettable, but I loved him unequivocally. Dick and his beautiful wife, Janie, provided a stable escape from the madness more times than I can. Benny's home, at the end of a cul-de-sac in their grand community, a block from the sea, was the opposite of escaping to Binion's Horseshoe. My father lived with the Cranes in the Pacific Palisades for months at a time over their decades-long friendship. Daddy sprawled out in every room, wandering around in his boxers like he owned the place. Throughout my 20s and 30s, that was the place I met up with my father when he was in my adopted home of Los Angeles. In contrast, I felt like a rugrat in their bright and spotless home. keeping my purses in duffel bags so not to take up too much space. Looking good, Hollywood, Daddy would say as we lounged by Dick and Janie's pool, feet from their tennis courts. This was the world we aspired to once we were able to climb out of Vegas.
Thank you. I think that that really sets it up well for the characters and the places that are throughout this book. One thing that I wondered about as I was reading the book, I think the story of Bluegrass Sons is it will be familiar to a lot of listeners of this podcast and people who are interested in Lexington history, but it's told from a different point of view.
Yeah.
And so can you kind of just provide a basic overview of what the story covers and what you wanted to achieve in telling it?
Well, I believe that there was a lot of misinformation out there about my mom's younger brother, Brad Bryant. And and it's kind of hard not, to say the Bluegrass Conspiracy, to not talk about the Bluegrass Conspiracy.
Okay.
It was about Uncle Brad and his best friend, Drew Thornton, and my father was in it, and our other friends, Anita Madden and Jimmy Lambert, and all these people that I grew up with that really didn't have anything to do with each other. Like, my dad and Brad all got together with the Chagras, and but this book, they kind of put everybody in a stew, like that Benny Binion stew, and, like, made it like they were
Mhm.
all in the same thing, and whereas Anita had nothing to do with Jimmy Chagra or the things, and, the Lexington drug scene in the '70s
Mhm.
was just the Lexington drug scene in the '70s. Uncle Brad going in for the CIA withdrew. How it originally started was right at the beginning of the war on drugs when they wanted to know what was going on with drugs. And so they sent Brad and Drew in just to kind of blend in, and then the same thing happened when they sent Uncle Brad to investigate the Chagra brothers, who were the gamblers in casinos, who are both in that other book too. And so while I wasn't, I was sort of trying to set the record straight, but more so I was telling who they were. They were so misinterpreted. The Bryants, my mom's family, are military families from, like, they were portrayed in this book as sort of kind of idle our rich kids, and it was sort of
Mhm.
like rich kids gone bad and turned drug smugglers when it was the exact opposite. I mean, my grandfather was a captain in the army in World War II, and his brother was in the army in World War II, and my uncle Earl, Brad's brother, was in Vietnam, a medic, and Uncle Brad was in the Marines, and their cousin had like 6 tours of Vietnam. It was just a military family all the way back, and they were portrayed as like these horsey people that were just rich and became drug smugglers. And
Mhm.
in fact, it was really sort of when they met at Swanee Military Academy, and when I started researching for the book, Drew Thornton and Uncle Brad that were the exact type of people that the CIA would get, people with connections that were close, but were sort of on the outside, but that were, hungry for a cause and malleable to be indoctrinated in all this way, which he loved Swanee Military Academy, and he loved the order and the duty and the structure of it all. And then it was seamless into the Marines, and then suddenly he became a spy.
Yeah, and I think you portray that really well. It's very well done in the book. And so, you mentioning that, the history of your family, the first part of the book, you do go through almost sort of a genealogy of your family and stuff. And so, how did you, were these just stories that were handed down, or did you have to do a lot of research to uncover this information? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, mostly we're a very close family on the Chandler side and the
Hmm.
Bryant side. And
Uh-huh.
I was dear, my grandmother, who was sort of Uncle Brad when he had to do a 10-year stint in federal prison, being moved 130 times, by the way. Deer was his fierce advocate, and Deer and I were really close, and I've always been fascinated with her. And her mother was a vaudeville actress. So I'd heard about that forever. And she was kind of pulled off the stage in Alabama. She and her sister were doing a vaudeville act. And I've always, becoming an actress myself, I've always been fascinated. And I have all these pictures that I've seen forever of them on stage. And then so there was that, and then I knew Maui's side, the maternal side. The paternal side, Jean Bryant, and Pommy and Daddy Fred, who I knew very well, it was important to me because in former folklore, they said something negative about my great grandfather. And my great grandfather, in fact, was the one responsible for building the children's hospital here in Lexington. And Fred Bryant, his picture is still there. And he came from extremely humble beginnings in Breathitt, which talking to Larry, my mom's cousin, and all these people discovered all these things. Pommy and Daddy Fred, I didn't really know their history and in Bloody Breathitt, and how they met at a boarding house. She ran a boarding house, and he worked at a circus. Like his first job when he was a teenager was to run the lights at a circus, and then he used to come in like for lunch, and she was sort of walking around, which I can see like it was a maybe like her walking around pouring, milk or whatever for the people that were and so I thought that was so romantic, but he had an alcoholic father who and kind of found and he wanted a better life for his family. So he took his brothers and sisters and his mother and drove them all to Lexington and started fresh and gave them all jobs and got an Oldsmobile dealership and became a Shriner and did all of these things, but was really a self-made man. And it was important that I honor his memory in this story because it's sort of Uncle Brad's story is we're all stories of our ancestors.
hmm Yeah, and that's such a relatable story too, as well. I mean, I think that story of people in living in Breathitt and then they had to move to try it somewhere else. I think
Right,
that's
right.
something that a lot of people can relate to in their family history.
Yeah.
And so, how did you do most of the research for the book? You did interviews with your uncle? Could you talk a bit about that? Or
Yes, it started with Uncle Brad and he was in his 70s and I had lived with him before when I was moving from California back towards Kentucky. He lived with my mom after he'd been in prison. At the same time, I was moving back and I had just gotten divorced and we both ended up living with my mom at the same time. And he had like this whole room was like a workout studio because he was always a health nut. And we used to walk around the baseball diamonds and he would say just little things like, if you knew some of the things I did, you would never look at me the same way again. And it was like he wanted to talk, but he was so straight-laced and so and I we just bonded in a way because it was my brother passed away and my dad had passed away and I was kind of like orphan. I knew that we knew things between us that my mom and everybody else didn't know just from this whole other world. And then when I called, somebody wanted to talk to him, and when I called and said, "Well, these people wanna interview you," and he was like, "Okay," and then my husband was like, "Why aren't you writing this book?" Every time we were trying to he's talking for the first time, 'cause he never talked, about any of this until now, and so he's like, "Okay, honey, I don't wanna ruin anybody's life by doing this," but we ended up doing 7 hours of interviews about his friendship with Drew and how it started and how he got in with the Chagres and how he got in with the CIA and a lot of his missions, and then it ironically splintered out when my cousin, his daughter, found out that I was doing a book about him, and she'd had a really tough life because of the Bluegrass conspiracy really
Mhm,
screwed up their whole life, and they all left Lexington
mhm,
with all rumors and just horrible things, but she did not want me writing about it, and I was like, "Well, now at this point, I'm like a year in, and I am, researching everything." So I had to but he was like, don't talk Uncle Brad wouldn't we talked, but I couldn't do any more recording, so I was writing and he was just, keeping peace. So I splintered out to all the other people and I got 36 hours of interviews and I called Oscar Goodman, the mayor of Las Vegas, and Fred Morelli, Uncle Brad's, which he gave the blessing for me to talk to everybody. Fred Morelli was his Chicago lawyer with him throughout, and John White Brown right before he died about their time in Las Vegas with my dad. And Jimmy Lambert, who I found out just passed away a few weeks ago, who owned the Library Lounge. I interviewed him about
oh,
their
wow.
and Grady Johnson about just the Lexington scene and Lucy Backer and then I interviewed a CIA expert, Douglas Valentine, who was really helped me understand the recruitment process and what it means to be an asset and a full-fledged, person and what it means to be somebody that they're going to disavow and what kind of people will go in for this kind of work which is, enormous.
Mhm. Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about your childhood, your time at Caesars when you were younger, and I mean that was like a really I think some of that comes across in the chapter you read at the beginning. It's like from a different time, and reading in the book about when your brother and and you would spend time at the casino. What was that like? I mean, and could you see that happening today with two
Oh
kids?
gosh. No, it was absolutely a different time, like everything is a different time, but this was, I lived in Malibu in the '80s. That will never be Malibu again,
Mhm,
That
mhm,
must it's like the same thing Miami in the, '60s, which I didn't experience, but that's a whole like that, the Las Vegas that we grew up in, we were like the only little kids there. There was one strip, and it was very glamorous, and all the adults dressed up to the hilt, and the boutiques and the statues, and there was only a few casinos. Like you can't even recognize what it's like now. I mean, I haven't. There's like no resemblance to what it used to be, but it was very exciting in that most of my time, my dad, was spent in the, showrooms, and my dad just kinda used as a babysitter. I'd just be wandering around. The pool was great. We always hung out by the pool, and that was fun, and we would see,
mhm.
Chris Christopherson and Peter Frampton and all these kind of people when we were out by the pool, but then otherwise, we would, in the daytime, watch the rehearsals of Andy Williams and Frank Sinatra and the Lennon Sisters and how they would put the show together, and then at night I'd just walk right up, by myself or with my brother, and the maitre d's would walk me right down to the front of the stage, and I'd just sit there and just be, gaga-eyed at the shows going on, and I mean, I can feel it in my bones still, that excitement that I don't even know where you would get it now. It's just very different, and I was
Mhm.
really glad to have experienced it.
Yeah, and that it really comes across in the book, that feeling that you're talking about. And I read an article in the Herald Leader about your book. They interviewed you, and there was a really great quote in there that I think also was in the book as well, where you said, "My father raised us in an environment that was equal parts moral high ground and seedy criminality." And I thought that was
Yeah.
great. And there's also a story in the book. I don't think it's giving anything away for me to ask you about it, but you talk about like $2 million hidden in the wall of a condo.
Yeah.
So that was
My dad, what's so strange is the people at the heart of this story, the Chagras, who my dad's job was to have get gamblers to come to Las Vegas and spend their money. And he became good friends with Lee Chagra from El Paso and his brother Jimmy. He was good friends with Lee, the criminal defense attorney. But Lee was the biggest drug smuggler at the time, which we didn't know. But Lee's son became our close friend, my brother's best friend since they were 12 years old until my brother passed when he was 30. But anyway, there's always money everywhere, like hundreds of dollars of bills. And I have pictures of me at like 11 with a t shirt on that says, I went to so and so and all I got was this, I don't even know, just some just dumb of those dumb t-shirts you had. And I'm like, got a wad. And then I've got all this money in the back of the car and I'm holding like a big stack of cash. And I remember like I would go shopping for clothes like when I was like 13 and buying these Susie cream cheese things that like Anita Mann would wear. And I would be hundreds of dollars. And my dad would just show up with like wads of $100 bills and pay for whatever I wanted, which was like look too old for me, but it was like that was my babysitter. And then I found out that my dad hid $1 million in our condo, which I was there all the time, like alone in the summers, and $1 million in the walls of the condo, which doesn't surprise any of us. And I imagine Jimmy Shagger probably gave my dad like 20,000 for that. It was seedy criminality, and at the same time, like, just like Carla Ward said, it was like, or maybe I said it first, but it was seedy criminality, and then it was my dad was always taking us out to the desert and giving us these moral lessons and, telling us this, and you can't trust anybody, and this is what you have to enjoy life, and you have to and it was always tears in his eyes because he didn't wanna get divorced. He loved my mother, and he did not wanna leave Kentucky, and he just went where he got the job. But
Mhm,
he was always so emotional and so he was like our best friend, and he was a kid, trying to
Hmm.
teach us all the lessons. Let me give you all the lessons so I can impart all these lessons. And then he's putting us smack dab, go to these like mobster places that are in casino, like Piero's, which is no longer there. And they show it in the movie Casino. And I remember this little Italian guy comes up to us and he's like smiling and patting my dad on his back and kissing me on the forehead. And he's like, my dad's like, "That's a guy you don't even wanna be on his good side." And I was like, "Okay, well, obviously we're on his good side." I don't know where this I mean, it was just he was kind of an outlaw in a way that he just was fascinated by all walks of life, and I think it
Yeah.
was like he was playing a game.
Yeah, and I'm sure in the process of learning all this about your family, I mean, I'm sure you found out surprising things, things that weren't so great to learn. And I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you put it together? You know?
It was so I did discover so much, and at the time, I started writing it in 2020, so it took 4 years to write, and of course, it was just inhaling everything about Narcos and, what was like in the '70s, and it was, before, Pablo Escobar, so what were they doing, and what was it like in Colombia, and what was it like in Nicaragua, and what was it like in when they were flying here, and then, what was it like in Miami at the Jockey Club, and, it was like a history lesson and reading everything and all these books about CIA, journalists that were getting murdered like Gary Webb, and so I was so ensconced in the learning of the time and the history and how and why my uncle would, become this other person. And he does say your lies are your life. You do become the devil you're searching for because in order to play that game. And then so it was kind of not until it was out that I was able to sort of sit back and reflect and go, I was kind of screwed up, wasn't you know? And then
And
it was like that was really dangerous. And it's like, my dad is one of those people that he's still as I'm shocked that we were never abused or abducted or anything. I mean, it's just amazing because we were walking around by ourselves almost all the time. And and it was but he was always, sort of heartbroken about, the breakup of the marriage. So it's like he's like all bets are off and I do of course blame him a little bit for my brother being having such, role models of Uncle Brad and Daddy and Lee Shagra, and it's like what is he supposed to how confusing for a boy. Whereas a girl, I got all fascinated with the glimpse and glamour and show business and all that. But it
mhm.
must have been really confusing for a 17-year-old boy when all these guns and which
Yeah,
ultimately killed my brother was a gun. And it's just that's what makes me really sad.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's a great story. I mean, the book goes from Breathitt County to Lexington to Vegas to Miami, Nicaragua. It has family drama, drugs, crime. So
Yeah,
it's really a sweeping story. I really enjoyed it. Was there anything else you wanted to cover that I didn't ask you about?
I don't know. I'm really glad you liked it.
Yeah.
I I don't know. I think what's interesting is that I feel like I covered what I wanted to cover the way it is now, and I'm very happy with it, but and as much as I wanna just let it go, there's so much more that I am just like, there's something in the back of my head, I'm like, I wanna hear these voices out loud that I've got on recordings.
Mhm,
So, I don't know in the future whether I'm ready to get on with my next book, which I've, been tampering with for a decade. I wanna maybe see this be a documentary or a podcast or something where we can hear these wonderful characters' voices, because I
mhm,
think it's a shame just to have, I
mhm.
love my book.
Yeah.
That there's something more, and plus I want to go to El Paso and like interview leader about it. I didn't push that because our families, I didn't know all these things, and we haven't connected since
Mm,
until then.
yeah.
So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Erin.
thank you so much. It was great to talk to you. And
Thanks.
thanks to the Lexington Public Library.
Our pleasure. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.